Welcome back. And once again, want to remind everybody before we really get started that much of these issues are covered in my book that has just been published called The American Conquest of Florida, which you can get via Amazon. And you see the picture on your screen. Anyway, back to our narrative. Thomas Jefferson is riding high in 1805. He's won a second term to the presidency. The opposition Federalist Party is basically out of commission. They're irrelevant in most of the country. Jefferson's great rival, Alexander Hamilton, is dead. He's been killed in a duel by Aaron Burr, who Jefferson found to be treacherous and disloyal and also someone without any sort of principle, completely devoid of principles, just driven by personal ambition. Because Burr has killed Hamilton, Burr will never again be a factor politically in the United States. So both Burr and Hamilton are gone. Effectively, the Federalist Party is collapsing. Jefferson wins overwhelming re-election. George Washington, who was effectively a rival of Jefferson by the end of Washington's life, he's dead. He's been dead since December of 1799. So Jefferson's riding high, but there's this one thing that he could not get resolved, which was the Florida question. And as we talked about in the last episode, he had sent James Monroe over to Europe, to the capitals of Europe, to try and negotiate. And then Jefferson very slyly, very covertly, somewhat duplicitly, gets money authorized from Congress to try and bribe Talleyrand and the French to put pressure on Spain to cede Florida. And absent that, maybe to buy Spain off directly. Those diplomatic efforts fail. And you have a situation where Jefferson is frustrated. The Congress is passing these resolutions in 1806 and 1807 in the midst of the other crisis going on, which is the imprisonment crisis and the embargo that Jefferson, on the advice of his Secretary of State, James Madison, put in place. The ill-fated Embargo Act of 1807. So Florida is still not being resolved, and Jefferson is determined to get Florida secured for the United States. And he's determined to do this diplomatically or by buying, by bribing a foreign nation. He is not wanting to do it by force. But James Madison, Jefferson's brother-in-arms politically, becomes president in 1809, and the situation changes pretty radically. While Jefferson and Madison were generally of like mind on almost everything, on the Florida question, they had different philosophies. As I just said, Jefferson, before leaving office, had been trying to work through the situation diplomatically, and in fact, conceded that France had in fact been correct in not including Florida in the Louisiana Purchase. But once Madison becomes president in March of 1809, he not only disagrees with Jefferson's interpretation of the Louisiana Purchase and the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase, but he begins a process by which Florida would be destabilized. And this starts first in West Florida, which is that area between the Apalachicola River, we've seen on some maps that we put in the first video and now in this video, it referred to as the Chattahoochee River. In fact, the Chattahoochee River flows into the Apalachicola River. But for purposes of identification, the Apalachicola / Chattahoochee River system, which of course the Flint River is also part of in South Georgia, between that west to the Mississippi. So Baton Rouge at this point is in West Florida, and Baton Rouge becomes the center of a crisis. And what we have is several weeks of a standoff culminating with
armed rebels who stormed Fort San Carlos at Baton Rouge, killed 2 Spanish soldiers. This was on September 23rd, 1810, in a sharp and bloody firefight, and they wrestled control of the region from the Spanish. The Spanish did not have many soldiers in this area. St. Augustine was very fortified. Pensacola was very fortified. Nothing else was in West Florida. And so the Republic of West Florida was declared. And upon learning of the revolt, President Madison wanted to move quickly to annex West Florida. But he knew he couldn't send the military in without Congress approving it. And Congress was out of session. And if you send the military in, the Spanish, it might cause a greater conflict. And at this point, the Spanish are fighting Napoleon in the Peninsular War. Bloody, bloody war. Napoleon put one of his brothers, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain. And the Spanish crown, per se, if you want to call them that, even though they had been ousted from power in some regard, as Napoleon puts his brother on the throne, they're aligned with the British. So the British, if you start a conflict with Spain, you might start a war with Britain, and it was a war that the U.S. could ill afford to fight. Now, they went ahead and fought it 2 years later, and they were still ill-equipped and could ill afford to fight it in 1812. One of the great strokes of luck in American history is that the United States wasn't torn apart and destroyed and fell apart as a country because of the War of 1812. I mean, I don't think historians and people who tell American history or tell the myths of American history talk enough about how idiotic that war was. Now, if you go north of the border into Canada, they talk about it all the time. To them, that was a war of independence. To them, the Americans were trying to conquer them. They stuck with the British Crown and were able to resist an American invasion. So anyway, at this point, you did not have an opportunity for Madison to get congressional approval. But he didn't want to let the opportunity pass, because if you let the opportunity pass, then it might pass forever. As I said, in 1803, when the negotiators had negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, they were more concerned about purchasing Florida than they were about purchasing what was the rest of Louisiana, or the French province of Louisiana. They wanted West Florida, and they wanted New Orleans, which is on the other side of the Mississippi River. But the Florida parishes, as we're going to talk about in a minute, extend all the way to Baton Rouge. They extend all the way to the Mississippi River. There was an election where Fulworth Skipwith was elected governor on November 7th of this newly independently declared state, the Republic of West Florida. He, for several weeks, prepared armed forces and wanted to wrestle the rest of West Florida away from the Spanish. Obviously, Baton Rouge and the areas along the Mississippi and what are now Louisiana were part of this new republic. The United States did not intervene at this point, and so Skipwith said because the U.S. had tolerated Spanish occupation of West Florida, they then didn't intervene in October or November of 1810. They forfeited their right. We're going to be independent. This was not something that the Americans could tolerate. So what ended up happening was, eventually, after Skipwith took the oath of office as the governor, there was a negotiated settlement where they began, and there was all kinds of drama. You don't want to get too into it. The fort in Baton Rouge, they had militarized this Republic of West Florida. Long story short, they negotiated a settlement with the Americans. So the Americans came in, and the flag of the Republic of West Florida was lowered. They had actually created a flag in December 1810. And on January 15th, 1811, Congress signed a joint resolution making this area part of the state part of the United States, and in 1812 it was added to the new state of Louisiana. So these are the Florida parishes of Louisiana. The areas of West Florida that are now in the state of Mississippi and the state of Alabama, they were not ceded to the United States until 1813, and that's something we can talk about in another podcast. This rebellion and this Republic of West Florida was very popular in what are now the Florida parishes of Louisiana. It was not supported in the areas which are now in Mississippi, Alabama, or Florida, the Florida Panhandle. And as we said, the Spanish colony of West Florida extended all the way to the Suwannee River. So that is why those are called the Florida parishes. And in 1990, the state of Louisiana formally designated that part of the state as the Republic of West Florida Historic Region, more colloquially known as the Florida parishes. And Interstate 12, which runs from Slidell, Louisiana, or a little past there, right, to Hammond. If you take I-10, you go south into New Orleans, and then you come back through Baton Rouge. Been designated as the Republic of West Florida Parkway. So you have a number of parishes that are now known as the Florida parishes. East Baton Rouge Parish, East Feliciana Parish, Livingston Parish, St. Helena Parish, St. Tammany Parish, Tangipahoa Parish, Washington Parish, and West Feliciana Parish. Those are all
But as I mentioned, there was no support at the time for this rebellion or this republic in what was the Mobile district of Spanish West Florida, or the district governed from Pensacola. So there were places that remained under Spanish control that are now part of Mississippi, which include Jackson County and Hancock County and Harrison County on the southern coast of Mississippi, southern Mississippi, very prominent region now in terms of gambling. They've been hit by a number of hurricanes, right, through the years. That area, Biloxi, Gulfport, Hattiesburg, all of those areas, all the way to Natchez. As we mentioned, Natchez was one of the towns, I think we mentioned this last week, was one of the towns in West Florida, in the colony of West Florida, in the British colony of West Florida. And Mobile County and Baldwin County, which are in Alabama, Gulf Coast of Alabama, they did not become annexed by the United States till 1813. And the boundary of Florida with the United States at the time, then after 1813, was affixed to the Perdido River, which is where the state boundary between Florida and Alabama remains today. Now, the U.S. annexation of those two counties in Alabama was received by James Wilkinson, General James Wilkinson, who is a particularly, I think, embarrassing figure in American history. He was an ally of Aaron Burr in his scheme to detach the West, parts of the West, from the United States. He was a horrible commander during the War of 1812, among other things. But he was actually the American general that received the Spanish surrender at Mobile in 1813 and took possession of that area. The War of 1812 was the impetus for this, as we've talked about, and we're going to continue to talk about throughout this series. Spain was aligned with Britain in European affairs. They were not a belligerent in the War of 1812 officially, but they were aligned with Britain. Britain and the United States were at war, and as we're going to talk about next week, Spain is fighting Americans, American kind of what I think the administration wanted to be characterized as rogue American settlers who had come into Florida from Georgia, but really had come in with the tacit approval of the Madison administration. They're fighting the Seminoles and the Spanish, and some British folks in East Florida. So we're going to talk about that next week. And I'll explain it all next week, but it's something that I think, from my historical research, I would say yes. Eventually, James Monroe, who's the Secretary of State, wants to characterize them as rogue Americans, but they're in fact people who were originally not only tacitly approved by President Madison, but in fact appointed and encouraged by President Madison to come to Florida and cause problems. So. We're going to get the next couple of weeks into the War of 1812 and its impact in Florida. And in fact, much of what goes on in Florida is related, at least somewhat directly, to the War of 1812 between the United Kingdom, between Britain and the United States. Thank you for watching. We will see you next week.